Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišák, and I work as the deputy head of the foreign desk at the Slovak daily Pravda, which by the name means truth, and is not the Russian Pravda. Pat Schumann is a professor of terrorism and political violence at Leiden University. In this episode of The Global Agora, we discuss his latest research article, Russia's low-level agents, characteristics, roles, and organizational structures of covert operatives in Europe 2022-2025. So, who are these low-level agents? How is Russia using them against Europe? And how can this security threat be addressed? Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. You can find the link in the description of this episode. And now, on to the new debate. Bart, you have just published a research article titled Russia's Low-Level Agents, Characteristics, Roles, and Organizational Structure of Covert Operations in Europe 2022-2025. Let's take a closer look at your findings. First, the characteristics. How do you define Russia's low-level agents?
Well, a couple of things stand out to me. So one of them, most are male. That's not very surprising. Men are overrepresented in dangerous and criminal activities more generally. But what did surprise me was their average age. So if we look at people in 2025, in that year, the average age was 34. Which is not exactly very young. And that's an interesting contrast because we know quite a lot about what's been called violence or crime as a service. Europol has written about this, for instance, where especially young people are recruited by criminal organizations to act as runners or to get drugs out of harbors and things like that. And in that context, most of the recruits tend to be adolescents, so people in their teens, maybe early 20s. But here we see Russia apparently preferring as their agents people who are a bit more mature, who are in their, mid-30s. And what's further interesting about this, I don't think it's just something that's been happening with these low-level agents who've been recruited after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. We know from other research that people who've been accused of spying for Russia in the 2000s and 2010s had a very similar age profile. So I don't know why exactly Russia appears to prefer somewhat older agents, but it does seem to be a preference that's been ongoing for quite a few years.
You said you don't know why is Russia preferring some more mature people, but I'm sure that you have a hypothesis as a researcher.
Unfortunately, I don't actually. I've been thinking about this quite a lot. I thought maybe it could have to do something with people who have some kind of recollection of Soviet times and who maybe have somewhat warm feelings for this period, or they romanticize things looking past. But if you were 34 in 2025, you didn't really go through much of the Soviet period. You were maybe born right around its end. So I find it hard to explain the apparent preference for people of this age. Something else, if I may, that stood out to me about these characteristics is that it has to do with nationality. And what we see is that most of these agents are Ukrainians. I shouldn't say most, that's not true, but the number of Ukrainians among these agents is very high. They are very much overrepresented. We also see people from Moldova, from Russia itself, or people who have dual Russian passports, and from Bulgaria. But the Ukrainians especially stand out. And again, the Russians don't really explain their actions, but it seems to me that this is a very deliberate tactic because you have, as Russia, let's say, a double effect. First, of course, you have agents who are willing to do your deeds for you, but then when it's public knowledge that something happened and the suspects are caught and they turn out to be Ukrainian, I think you have also a psychological effect, especially, for instance, in a country like Poland, where lots and lots of Ukrainian refugees have been offered a place to stay, but where there's also really kind of a strong societal debates about how many Ukrainians the country can absorb and all those things. In such a setting, if you have these news items about Ukrainians conducting sabotage for the Russians in Poland, for instance, that really also has a psychological effect that I'm sure the Russians are very happy with.
One more thing about the age of these agents. Maybe Russians just prefer a little bit more responsible people that mean a little bit more mature. But this is, just a remark.
Maybe, but the things that they do are not very responsible.
That's true, of course. You mentioned nationalities, right? And are there any Western Europeans among those people?
Oh, for sure. So I'm from the Netherlands. We've had at least 3 people from this country, or 4, I believe, who became involved in plots for the Russians. We see people from the UK, from France, from Germany, from a whole range of countries, including also non-European ones like Cuba and Colombia, which I found quite surprising. But it's surprising how many, let's say, former Soviet or Eastern Bloc states are represented. And I mentioned Ukrainians. I also think it's quite surprising that Russia would use so many of its own citizens, Russian nationals, but often also dual nationals, so someone like from Germany, but with a Russian passport as well. And so clearly they are not reticent about using their own citizens for what are often very dangerous operations, in the sense that most of these people appear to get caught. And if you get caught, you're facing a really long time in prison. Not so long ago in the UK, for instance, there was a group of people convicted of setting a warehouse on fire on behalf of Russia. And I think they got somewhere between 8 and 12 years in prison, which is a very serious amount of time to spend. And if you look at what they received in return, a couple thousand, maybe 10,000 euros, that's certainly not a very good return on investment.
What can we say about the recruitment process of those people?
That's a good question. I mean, it's not very clear in many instances, but we do know, or we have a few anecdotes that I think are revealing. So what often seems to happen is that people visit pro-Russian Telegram channels. And there they might come across a message saying, if you're a real patriot, follow this link and we can see what you can do. And that's the first step towards recruitment. Oftentimes we see people be given a simple task first. So they might be asked to go into a city like Brussels, say, and put up stickers with a very anti-NATO or pro-Russian message to them. They're supposed to make a recording, a video or a photo, send that to their handler. And if the handler is happy, they'll be paid a small amount of money in cryptocurrency, maybe 50 euros. And quite often then there's a next step. Okay, you did the stickers, but can you make a Molotov cocktail? Can you make a video showing that it works? Great, here is 100 euros in crypto. And then it might be, okay, now your assignment is to make a Molotov cocktail, but throw it against a warehouse containing supplies for Ukraine. Make a video and you'll be paid a much larger amount. And then this continues until the person is caught most of the time. But it's not just Telegram, I hasten to say. We also see people being recruited through interpersonal contacts. So simply because they knew someone who was involved. In one case, for instance, it was former USSR submarine officers who, for unclear reasons, became involved in this plot, knew each other, involved each other, and thereby played a role. There's a smaller amount of cases where it seems that people were pressured. So someone might be facing prosecution in Russia. They are caught by the authorities, but they don't end up spending any time in prison. And a few years later, we see them in one of these plots. And it's quite logical to suppose that they were, kind of released from prison, but only on the condition that they would work for the Russian intelligence services. So there's a variety of ways in which people find themselves involved in these plots. I think Telegram channels, recruitment online is probably the primary avenue, but not the only one.
We have seen recently quite a few instances of attacks especially against the Jewish targets, and that are probably related to Iran. Is Iran basically copy-pasting the Russian tactics?
Yes, I think we can make that supposition. I think there's quite a lot of investigating to be done before we know for sure how these people were recruited. There are clear signs, at least, pointing towards Iran. I think it's important to say that I don't think they're necessarily copy-pasting the Russians, because the Iranians have been doing this for a long time as well, dating back quite a few years, also recruiting organized criminals to carry out assassinations and such. My kind of intuitive impression here, so that could be really up for change as we know more, is that the Iranians seem to put more emphasis on people from a very clearly organized crime background. And they also seem to put perhaps a bit more emphasis on very young people, as we saw being used, at least in the attacks in the Netherlands in past months. And I think the Russians, again, we spoke about age, they seem to be recruiting from a somewhat older pool. And while they certainly also recruited people with criminal backgrounds, and they seem to be quite prevalent, it's not just people with, let's say, ties to organized criminal milieux who are used by the Russians.
So you mentioned a couple of things already, but can we say a little bit more about how Russia is using these low-level agents, how they are mainly used, for what purposes?
So Russia seems to use these low-level agents for a range of purposes. Most of them have to do with something like related to sabotage. So they might be asked to burn down buildings. We saw that in Poland. We saw it in the Baltic states with an IKEA being burned down. And we see it with warehouses being put to the torch. But we also see them being used for, if you will, even more serious offenses where it comes to acts of what I consider to be state-sponsored terrorism, namely the 2024 DHL plot, where incendiary packages were placed on DHL cargo airplanes with the apparent purpose of bringing them down as these packages ignited while they were in flight. That only happened, or didn't happen, I should say, because these planes were delayed or the package malfunctioned and things like that. So they're used for a range of activities. Sometimes we see them also being involved in what could be termed surveillance, intelligence gathering. So it requires a large number of things.
But what we are discussing can be broadly described as Russia's hybrid war against the West, against Europe. But do we have to say hybrid? It is simply a war, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there are some issues with the term hybrid anyway. It's been used in such a broad fashion that it's not really clear what it means. Many things seem to fall under it. Is it a war, you ask? I hesitate to use that term. I think what we're seeing is quite, sufficiently covered by the term covert actions, covert operations, sabotage. And those are serious enough without trying to ask, is this then war or not? And we also have a whole range of cyber operations taking place from Russia against Europe. So there's a lot going on. I think it's very clearly a conflict that has the potential to escalate further, but I would hesitate to use the term outright war.
Do we know if there is a dedicated structure within the Russian security apparatus which is running these low-level agents?
Well, it seems that most of these operations are run by the GRU or GU, the Russian military intelligence. Some have been linked to the FSB, so the Federal Security Service. And within both of these intelligence services, you do have particular departments or units that seem to be primarily responsible for these operations. So yes, I would say that they, especially in the case of the GRU, which has been, I think, most active in this regard, they do have a dedicated operational structure revolving around recruiting agents and running operations.
From the cases of people who were caught and they are now in jail or waiting for the trials, can we say what they are saying about their motives?
Yeah, motives is quite difficult to disentangle at this moment, largely because many of these people are still in trials that are ongoing. And I think many will have reason not to reveal too much about what they were doing. So we have to go a little bit based on the bits and pieces of information we can find. And there it does seem that monetary compensation plays a very large role. Many people simply seem to be in this for the money. They don't care who pays them. It can be a criminal organization. It can be a state. As long as they get paid, they don't care by who or for what. However, I think there's also quite a few cases in which there is at least some, let's say, ideological affinity with Russia. So maybe they're not fully on board with the whole message of, Russia becoming a great power again, but there is some kind of support for what the Russian state is doing. And then I think in a small number of cases, people don't really know what they were getting into. They were misled or they were pressured. But I would say money first, then some degree of ideological affinity, and in a small number of cases, being pressured to carry out these jobs.
You write that you use a new dataset of 145 low-level agents. How strict were your criteria for including individuals on this list?
That's a good question. So what I did was I went over a previous dataset I'd made of suspected Russian hybrid or covert actions against Europe. And for each of these actions, I tried to see were so-called low-level or disposable agents involved. And where this was suspected, those people I included in the current study. And now this is a rather broad approach, I admit, and it's also sensitive to the fact that many of these cases are still being debated in court. So it could be that many of the people, or at least some of the people in my study, will not be convicted of being Russian agents. So I think there's a lot still up for debate, and I think I also acknowledged this in the paper, but I thought it was worthwhile to try and make at least a kind of first effort here, because these are ongoing security threats, and I hope this can make a contribution, no matter how small, to us understanding and dealing with this issue.
So what did you learn when you are saying that it might help us to understand and dealing with those issues. So from your perspective, what did you learn?
So a couple of things stand out. First, I mentioned before the nationalities, right? Many of these are Eastern European, former Soviet bloc kind of nationalities involved. We've seen some states like Germany run public-facing campaigns telling people not to become an agent for Russia. That's potentially very useful, but I think my study shows we need to target this specifically towards diaspora and refugee communities. It isn't really let's say, the general Dutch person here in the Netherlands who is at risk, but much more specifically, for instance, Ukrainian refugees. So that's one element. Another thing that I hope adds to the ability to prevent these types of operations is greater clarity on what these people look like in terms of their characteristics. So if we know, for instance, that Russian agents tend to be a bit older, that they tend to have this national background, then maybe it's somewhat easier for our intelligence and police services to isolate potential agents from a broader pool of people who might be doing illegal activities through online contact. And what I also hope can be of benefit is I put a bit of effort into making a so-called social network analysis, trying to see what these networks look like. So you have the agents carrying out operations, but then who do they receive their instructions from? And how is that person tied to the next person in the chain? And well, I mean, this is maybe a bit too much to go into here, but I think it does show a particular picture of how Russian services operate, where they use very compartmentalized networks that don't know each other most of the time, that are very hierarchical. There's lots of intermediaries between the agents and the people in the intelligence services running them. However, in some cases, it seems that Russian intelligence officers take shortcuts and they essentially undermine their own operational security. Rather than going through the intermediaries that are supposed to keep them at distance and supposed to give them plausible deniability, they will sometimes directly message the agents on the sharp end of things. And they may think that they are safe, that they are anonymous, they may not care too much. There's all kinds of reasons why they might do this. But it does make them much more vulnerable to being detected as Russian officers involved in these plots, which I think can be something of an embarrassment for the Russian state if this can be proven. So maybe there are some gaps here that our intelligence services could exploit.
Have you seen those cases, like Russian officers making some mistakes when handling those agents?
Yeah, there are a couple of cases where at least some Russian officers have, I think, quite plausibly been tied to these cases with their full name and everything. That's the work of investigative journalists at places like Dossier Center and V-Square, for instance. I can't really think of any names top of my head right now, but it's certainly quite easy to find a few of those examples if listeners are interested.
But your study focuses exclusively on low-level agents involved in covert action against Europe related to the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. There are other Russian activities, of course, in Europe, but what are the most recent and most damaging covert actions carried out by Russia and Europe using low-level agents?
So the DHL plot I mentioned, 2024, but what I think is so worrying about that one wasn't a one-off. Last year in May, we had the authorities in Germany arrest 2 people and 1 person in Switzerland on suspicion of a very, very similar plot. And this happened again in October in Poland of 2025, where another cell of people was at least suspected of being involved in a very similar attempt to ship incendiary parcels through air freight. And of course, we had in fall of last year as well, and again in Poland, we had the sabotage that was actually carried out of the Polish railway. It was bad enough in itself and could have really caused large-scale suffering if also a train had actually driven over the part of the track that had been blown up. And there too, it appears that low-level agents were involved. So we have a string of these operations until very, very recently that have a very serious connotation as well.
How effective is this concept for Russia? And are European countries able to at least partly successfully address this security threat?
Yeah, that's a really good question to ask, because I mean, in many cases, I think not all that much came of these operations, right? We shouldn't overstate what these people are able to achieve. I go back to the few instances that are especially worrisome, the DHL plot, the other airline plots, the blowing up of the train tracks in Poland. These definitely are serious security threats, but not in all cases. We have to remember that most of these low-level agents don't have any specific training or expertise. So we may not expect them to be the most effective agents that Russia can field. So, yeah, I try to take a bit of a middle course between not underestimating the threat, but also not being immediately too worried about this phenomenon.
And what about how we can address it? Yes, we can discuss how dangerous it is. And I think it is dangerous. It is still very risky behavior. And, I think in many cases, just by chance, nothing more serious happened. So you mentioned, for example, the activities of German authorities, but how to address this security threat?
Yeah, it's a good question. What can we do about it? I think probably behind the scenes, our intelligence and security service are already doing a lot about it. And I say this because it seems to me that the number of hybrid covert operations that Russia has been carrying out against Europe have been declining somewhat from a high point in 2024 until the present. There's still obviously things happening, quite a lot of them, many of them very serious, but the overall number of incidents appears to be slowly going down. We don't know for sure why that is the case, but I think that one reason here is that our intelligence services have caught up to how Russia organizes many of these attacks and have been better placed to put countermeasures in place. But I think the bigger question is, how do we prevent Russia from even wanting or trying to launch these operations? And I think there we still have, as Europe, quite a bit of work to do, because I think it's about deterrence. Can we successfully, as Europe, or maybe as a so-called coalition of the willing, deter Russia from trying to hit us with these kinds of operations? Are we able to say, if you cut undersea cables again, or if you try to blow up train tracks again, we will do X, Y, and Z? I think that will be very difficult. I'm not trying to advocate for, immediately using far-reaching consequences, such as closing the airspace over Ukraine using our own air defense systems, although that could be like a last resort kind of thing. But we have to have believable steps until such a last measure, I would say. And this, I think, is something that we will find very difficult to do because there's not enough consensus, is my impression, in Europe for putting something as risky like that together. But unless and until we have a more, I think, plausible and effective deterrent as Europe or as a coalition of the willing, who are also most frequently targeted by Russia, I think the Kremlin will essentially feel they're free to continue to try to do these things. And this has become all the more important now in that Europe is increasingly on its own. I mean, I think it's become clear that under the current American presidency, we have very little to expect in terms of help from our American erstwhile allies when it comes to threats from Russia. So I think it's increasingly clear we need to do this as Europe. I know that lots of efforts are underway in this direction, but I think we're certainly not there yet.
In theory, could the West, or at least Ukraine, and probably Ukraine is doing this, but could the West use similar low-level methods against Russia?
For sure, and I think Ukraine is doing this in Russia. I think, let's say, other European nations probably not, or at least to a much smaller degree, maybe limited to intelligence gathering, because this is very provocative. Like if you use low-level agents to conduct sabotage or even terrorism in a state like Russia, and there's of course a big risk of escalation. So I can't really see states besides Ukraine being willing to run that risk, but Ukraine does do similar operations. And I think we should also note that the kind of low-level agents being used by Russia in Ukraine, for instance, tend to also conduct much more violent activities than those that we've seen being used in Europe.
But do you think Russia might seek to expand the role of low-level agents, perhaps elevating some of them to more significant positions and assigning them more dangerous tasks, such as broader sabotage or even political assassination? It seems that Russia, in a way, has a pool of individuals at its disposal, and perhaps some of the more capable ones could be deployed in a variety of roles. Don't you think so?
Yeah, I think that's certainly possible. I think we also have to remember that the people I was able to study for this project, for instance, are those people who got caught. Now, it very well might be that there's a much larger pool of people still out there who haven't gotten caught yet. And maybe through luck or because of their background, were much better equipped to evade the authorities and may, at this point in time, have become more experienced as agents for Russia and thereby more dangerous. So I think it's certainly plausible that there's some more high-quality agents still at large. And we've seen Russia's willingness to use such people for anything from sabotage and influence operations to carrying out acts of terrorism. So I don't think we should be surprised if they do so again in the future, especially as they don't really seem to have many other means for striking back at European nations supporting Ukraine. At the same time, I think we should also realize that Russia puts a lot of effort into disinformation campaigns that don't necessarily need low-level agents, and that they're really trying to exploit the weaknesses in Western societies, for instance, by supporting far-right and far-left political parties, as they seem to have done in the run-up to the elections in Germany last year, for instance, and as they've done more recently in other elections taking place across Europe. So the bigger threat may be not the physical sabotage that Russia carries out using agents, but the attempt to undermine our democracies and the rule of law by spreading misinformation at a really large scale and by trying to empower pro-Kremlin voices at the national and European political levels.
And one last thing, we have been discussing this topic for quite some time. Your study about the acts of sabotage by Russia, we had an interview about that. Now we are talking about low-level agents. What's next? What does Russia has under its sleeve?
I think what's next depends a lot on how these so-called negotiations about Ukraine's future go. And I think that depends in turn a lot on the degree to which the Trump administration is willing to push Ukraine to accept a settlement that is unfavorable to it, the degree to which Russia can keep Trump more or less on its side, as seems to be the case. Trump certainly has been far more critical of Ukraine's President Zelensky than he has ever been of Russia's President Putin. So I think the Russians, at least until relatively recently, expected quite a lot from these so-called negotiations, but it's becoming less and less clear whether Trump can actually deliver anything in terms of peace favorable to Russia, especially as Ukraine now seems to have a bit of initiative on the battlefield, and it seems much less vulnerable than it did over the last winter. And also because I think Trump is occupied elsewhere with his debacle in Iran. So maybe his ability to influence the turn of events here in Europe is more constrained. But I still think that the American angle in all of this will be very, very telling. Do they still retain some kind of role in European security, or do they leave us as Europeans to fend for ourselves, which may create opportunities for Putin to strike more than he has so far? So it's very hard for me to predict the future, but I think a lot will depend on what the current American administration decides to do.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe and listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. The link is in the episode description. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.